have a conversation, a bit of an interview, a bit of a conversation over the next 15 minutes or so. And we're really going to be looking about what, as the UK church, we can learn from the Iranian church, the persecuted Iranian church, what lessons we as UK church pastors and leaders can learn. And it's great to have some guests with me on the stage. So Mojtaba and Debrina, thank you so much for coming to be, I'll introduce Phil in a minute, but guys, thank you so much for coming to Ekklesia and being with us. So you guys are originally from Iran. Can you just tell us a little bit about what's been happening in Iran over the last kind of 15, 20 years, a little bit of the context of Iran? And then the church scene, what it's been like to be a Christian. Just paint the picture. Some people will know something about the Iranian church, and some people may know very little. So if you could just paint a bit of a picture, that would be wonderful.
I'll keep it very short because I'd rather tell stories later. So I'll keep this very short. Since 2009, the government started closing down Protestant churches. Today, we have no more open, functioning Protestant church in Iran. Evangelical and Protestant Christians in Iran are considered terrorists, Zionists, and a threat to national security. If you're Orthodox and Catholic, you have certain permission in your church activities, but if you're Protestant, you are a threat to national security. These are for Assyrian Armenians, Christians, but for converts from other religion, I believe like Mojtaba, who came from Islam, there's absolutely no place to worship. So they're forced to gather in houses, in parks, in public places, restaurants, to have their gatherings. Very short.
That's brilliant. Yeah. Absolutely brilliant. Mojtaba?
Yeah, so I came to Christ like 17 years ago. Oh, wow, I feel old a little bit. I was 18. So in that time, 2005, before like around 10 years, let's say in 1990s, kind of movements happened in Iran. Many people gave their heart to Jesus, like mostly Muslims background, and I was a part of that. I don't know, call it movement or whatever. Just God was working in Iran powerfully in that time, and many churches were so busy, and that's why in 2009 the government became really kind of concerned about church activities, and so as churches were being shut by the government, Christians started going to house churches. And so our house churches started in 2006 until 2012, and in that time, during that time, I was also I knew many other house churches, and so the church went into people's houses. So, for example, a family like a husband coming to Christ. Inviting his Christian friends into house, and the wife is in the room hearing the worship songs, and they're talking about Jesus and questioning her husband, and then after a while coming to Christ. And so many families started to come into Christ. Many people coming to Christ as a family, and there was a very big numbers of people coming to Christ. Like my family, I'm one of 6, and 4 of us came to Christ during a month. Yeah.
Brilliant, brilliant. So let's just delve down for a minute more on the cost. You know, we've heard about the cost of being a Christian, the cost of discipleship. Guys, from your own personal experience or from friends or fellow Christians in Iran, just if you can, as real or as honestly as you can, just tell us, what is that cost of following Jesus that you've experienced in Iran, and what that's meant?
So the cost for a Christian, someone who become a Christian as a Muslim background or whatever background, I mean, any religion except from Islam, they're not allowed to practice their faith, and they might end up to like, I'm trying to find the best words, being kicked out from their job, universities, rejected by the family, and also being imprisoned. Yeah. So when I was 20 years old, so when I was 19, we started our house group, which was kind of a miracle. We found it was very difficult to find other Christians, and but in such a miraculous way, we were connected to a couple of Christian families, and for 1 year we had our regular meetings. And after having those regular meetings, when I was 20 years old, it was early in the morning. I was preparing the breakfast, and there was a knock on the door, and it was, I was very surprised. Who is knocking the door very early in the morning? And I opened the door, and there was like 10 officers standing in front of the door, and they say, we have to research your house by the order of court. And I say, can I see the paper? They just pushed me into the house and raided into the house and started searching everything about Christianity. And my family, actually, they were sleeping. I've got 3 sisters and my mom. It was very shocking for them. And it was very, very heavy and dark and intense moment. You know, my family were crying, and we weren't allowed to move. And just these strangers being in our house very easily, our house being invaded by these people, and you feel, when I don't have security and I can't be safe in my own house, where should I go, Yeah. And it's just like you found yourself so vulnerable, and then they put handcuffs on me and my family members who were Christians, and put blindfold over my eyes, and they put us in separate cars, took me to intensive service jail, and they kept me there for 22 days in solitary confinement. Yeah.
Wow. Debrina?
You were speaking before about discipleship. We saw discipleship in 2 ways within our church. The first is an intense encounter with Jesus. It's quite known in Iran and the Middle East that when 2 ex-Muslims would meet, they ask each other, have you seen the white man? Have you heard that before? Have you seen the white man? Have you seen Jesus? So intense encounter with Jesus is what we are experiencing in Iran among the Muslims. And that intense encounter brings out a following of Christ and paying the price. Let me tell you one story of this elderly lady. We call her beautiful auntie because she's beautiful for her age. She has a heart for Jesus. She was asked for interrogation. She did evangelism. I'm not going to tell you her story, but she did a lot of evangelism. And we used to tell her, don't speak about Jesus. So what happened? They called her for interrogations. Interrogations in Iran will take the minimum 8 hours to maximum few weeks. You don't know then when it will end, but the minimum is 8 hours. We've done this, we've all been interrogated, we prepped her in advance, we told her what they're gonna ask her, how she should respond, all that she's gonna do. We drove her in for her interrogation. We told her, you know what, when you're done, give us a call, whether it's today, tomorrow, we'll wait for you, we'll come and pick you up. So we were on our way back home. About 4 hours later, she called us and she said, I'm done, come pick me up. Well, that's not possible. You just broke the record. You cannot be done. I'm done. We went, we picked her up, we came home and said, Auntie, what happened? How was that so fast? What did they do? So she said, they told me not to evangelize. And I told them, you know what? I used to be sick. I had a problem that no doctor could figure out what the problem was. So I went to the doctors, I had everything. One night, I saw Jesus, who came to my dream, and he told me the problem is in the kidney. I should go to the doctor, I should tell the doctor. They would check it out. I went to the doctor, they checked it out, the problem was there. So they could operate it and come and bring it out. 2 weeks later, my daughter was in the hospital. She saw Jesus walk in the hospital, and Jesus healed her, and Jesus healed her daughters. Jesus touched her son. So she tells the whole story, and they say, you know what? Okay, we get it, but still, don't tell anybody else. That's okay. That's your experience. Just don't share it with other people. And she says, no, you don't get it. Look, I was sick many years ago. Doctors couldn't find out what was my problem. So I had a dream. In my dream, Jesus came. Tells the story again. They say, okay, we get it. Do whatever you want at home with your family, not with other people on the streets. She says, you don't get it, do you? Look, you need to get this. I was sick many years ago. No doctor could find out what's the problem. So she told the story at least 4 times. At the end, they were like, you know what? Just go out. Please leave. She went to prison. She lost her house. We were there when they took away her house, everything. One of the young soldiers came to her and said, Mother, go in, take everything you want. Take your money, take your documents, take jewelries, everything you want. I'm not going to report it, I promise you. She went inside of the house, took her Bible, put it under her arm, came out, and she said, that's all I want. The money, the document, the rest is yours. That's what I want. So there's 2 things. Intense encounter with Jesus brings intense discipleship. It brings following of Jesus and paying the price. If the first one is not there, don't ask your people to do the second one. Don't force them to pay the price because they need to encounter Jesus intensely. All right, that's it.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's awesome. Okay, we're going to hear some more from you guys in a moment. Phil, so by way of introduction, let me just say I've known Phil for many years. Phil, you used to lead a church in southwest London, which probably by all of our standards we would think would be a thriving, wonderful church that you might say would be your dream job, but you're currently not doing that anymore, and you were inspired by the Iranian church. So do you want to just, in your own words, just tell us a little bit of your story and how that came about and what inspired you about the church in Iran and leading into kind of where you're up to today?
Yeah. Well, it's hard not to be inspired, isn't it? You come into contact with this and you think, this is interesting. This is life-changing. At least it should be. And I came into contact with the Iranian church, I think, towards the end of the COVID lockdown. And what attracted me to, what you've just heard shared was it seemed to answer so many of the questions that I think COVID asked us. A lot of people left our churches and didn't come back. They weren't disciples. They had a 1.5 years off and decided they were all right without Jesus. And possibly more worrying, a lot of people who were really doing well with Jesus actually enjoyed lockdown and said they found it spiritually refreshing. They found it very hard to come back to church because actually it wasn't feeding their spirituality. It was actually a detriment to their spirituality. And those are really big things to recognize, aren't they? And I felt by the end of just watching the church I was leading and what was happening, and I do think God was trying to speak to the British church during that crisis that we went through. It's not really a crisis, is it, when you hear the Iranians talk? But for us, it was meant to be an eye-opener. And I think it asked us those kind of questions. Is what we are putting our energy into creating the kind of followers that Jesus died for? And when I saw people who I'd thought were strong Christians drifting away, and when I saw people who I knew were strong Christians thriving in the absence of some of what I'd been so busily providing for them for years, I really felt I've got to find answers to these questions. And it was then that I came into contact with the Iranian believers. They'd just before lockdown, they'd produced a video called Sheep Among Wolves. If you go to YouTube and type in Sheep Among Wolves Part 2, That's the documentary about the revival in Iran. I watched it and I felt this is answering the questions that we're asking. And I think I'm a white British person. I've traveled to just about every continent as a preacher to teach people from the Bible, to come from the UK and to say, we know everything. Why don't you lead your churches like we do in Britain? I think there's an invitation for us as the church in the UK implodes, for us to have the humility to say, I'm not sure we need to travel to do the teaching. I think we need to travel to do the learning. And so I came to a place when I was hearing people like Debrina. We've only just met, but what Debrina's just shared is very normal amongst the Iranian believers. And I just came to the conclusion, I don't need to teach you. I need to go back to school again and learn from you. And when these guys open the scriptures, they haven't got theological degrees, but I found they understood the words of Jesus far better than I did.
That's so good. That's so good. So, Phil, maybe talk for a moment about the cost, because you've made a particular decision. You no longer lead the church that you were leading in southwest London. So, it might be different to the cost we've heard over here in Iran. But just tell us, what's the cost? Because you made an intentional decision to go kind of a slightly different path. And there's been a cost for you. Just to share a little bit about that cost, different cost, but what's that cost been to you to go down this, more intentional discipleship, different way?
Well, we're all going to pay a cost. That's the first thing. In 1 Corinthians 3, Paul says, when Jesus comes back, our work is going to be tested. And what's gold and silver will remain, and what's wood and straw and hay will burn. So there's going to be a cost. Question is whether we embrace that cost now or whether we just pay the cost at the end. It felt to me like COVID was Judgment Day come early. I saw that a frightening amount of what I'd been busily building for years was not gold or silver. It was wood, stubble, and straw. And I thought, well, I can either pay that cost up front and do something different, or I can pay a far bigger cost down the line. And so I briefly tried to engage with my church and kind of say, I don't think we should be going back to where we were. I think God's given us an opportunity to fundamentally rewrite who we are as a church. That conversation didn't last very long. I'm looking forward to hearing Steve talk, because I know Steve's taken his church on a far braver journey of actually changing together. I think it became obvious to me quite early on that I was better off letting those who shared the vision I had before COVID to carry on leading and to start from scratch along the lines I was learning from the Iranian believers. Simply the cost that I paid is I said, I'm going to step out of this and I'm going to start again, which I think is really what the prophet Jonah did. He was on a ship. He was headed for Tarshish. He didn't quite know how to get back to dry land. But all he knew is that he'd rather be thrown off the ship than end up in Tarshish. And I felt like my life and ministry was headed for Tarshish, and it was time to get off. And I didn't quite know what the fish was going to be, but I thought if faith in Jesus is worth anything, then if Jesus is talking to me, I need to be willing to jump. So that was. It turns out jumping into the arms of Jesus is not as costly as you think. But it felt like a cost at the time.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that, Phil. So I'd love to kind of bring everyone into kind of the final part of our conversation. So what do you think, 2023, we've heard from the Iranian church, we've had some wonderful wisdom and challenge. What would you say? Mojtaba, you now been here 4 years, training to be in church leadership, doing theology. What from your view, from that unique perspective, what would you say to the UK church? What would be the challenge that you would want to bring? You can be as honest as you like. What would be the challenge that you would want to bring to your fellow brothers and sisters who lead churches in this country?
Yeah. So I think the whole subject of persecuted church, it has a prophetic sense. As soon as you, when you heard about persecuted church, and as soon as you become aware of it, that there is some Christians in some places, other places in the world, they going through a lot, like suffering and being discriminated, being imprisoned, and some countries being killed because of their faith. You can't just leave it. You have to have a response to it. What I mean is, what was I going to say? What I mean is, there is a calling in persecuted church. There is a reason why brothers and sisters on this earth going through suffering. It's just express something about gospel. You know, you receive email and there is an attachment. See the below, you know, the attachment. Persecuted church is the attachment of the gospel. You can't never ever disattach it from email, you know. It's necessary. And the calling is that our brothers and sisters going, I felt that the persecution I went through, it was a calling. It wasn't like just because of the injustice in that country. God uses the injustice and like the countries like Iran, and he chooses some ordinary people like me to do extraordinary jobs through them, you know. And he just wants to give a message to the rest of the church that this faith that we have and we share is just one faith, one Lord. It's so precious and it's so important that someone should leave everything they have. And it is true. The eternal hope they have in persecuted church, eternal hope, the kind of eternal perspective. During the whole thing, the whole process, I had the eternal perspective constantly. I couldn't, as soon as, you know, all the church, faith elements we have, it has the kind of eschatological view. Without the eschatological view, none of them has any meaning. Like as Paul says, if Jesus is not coming back and he's not alive, we are the most miserable ones on this earth, going through this suffering. So what I mean is, a couple of things I hope I can share with you through my story is, do we pay enough cost for our faith? There is, how can I say it? It's not always enough cost, whatever we paid already. You know, you need to pay more. That's it. Because this salvation that Jesus giving us is worth it. Now, maybe this cost is about changing some of your plans, just taking some risks, be bold to take some risks. Whatever it is, just pray about it. Where should I pay more cost? When I came out of the prison, God gave me, I was just like thinking about the whole thing. I was very young, you know. When I was 24, I went to prison again for 3 years. And after 3 years, I came out. I was just thinking, I was praying, and I just felt that God is speaking to me. And it was just, God reminded me the verse in Hebrew chapter 12, that in your struggle with sin, against sin, you haven't shed your blood yet, something like this. It means you haven't given your life yet in a struggle of sin. And God was telling me that all of your young years, when I was 20, going to prison, 24, going to prison, seeing my family suffer a lot because of that, my mother's tears, the whole burden came on my family, and everything I went through in prison, which wasn't easy. And then I had to leave my country, going to Turkey, become a refugee. God told me, it was like God telling me that you haven't enough price yet for your faith. It's not enough. Wow. And he wasn't saying it in a sense that he's demanding, look, you should pay more. It's not enough for me, you know. It was like he was emphasizing on the importance and the value of the salvation and faith I have, you know, that you have to give your life, you know, and the cost I'm talking about is not all the church activities we have, you know, we spend all our time in church. No, it's about, I don't know, where I put my hope, where I put my whole faith, where I see the values of things. So one of the things is see where, because the reason I shared this, sorry,
No, it's fine.
God is about to doing something in the UK. If you, I don't know, in your churches and churches, you know, many people talking about revival, talking about hunger, talking about repentance, talking about the hunger among young people. And many people talk about, oh, God is doing something, God is doing something. And it's just started that God is doing something. And people become excited. But anytime that something wants to happen in like a breakthrough of God's kingdom, there should be a price we pay. You know, without paying a price, nothing will change.
So good.
And we need to pay the price, yeah.
Thank you. Debrina, anything to add? You're kind of...
Also very short. I'm a pastor in Switzerland, been pastoring for 12 years. I've been mad at church in Western country after all I've seen, I have experienced myself with my family. Today, I came to a place where I learned a very good lesson for myself as a pastor. I will be the change. I will stop preaching change. Yes, revival is coming, but revival is not coming to my church. Revival is coming to me. I'm the revival. I will be revival. I will revive through the Spirit of God. Don't wait for your church and other people to bring revival. Worship team, I am. You are. Be the change. Be the revival. Be the story. I keep telling stories to the church, but after 12 years, I'm tired of telling stories. Stories is amazing. I'll tell you stories if you want. But I learned I'm the story. Yeah. And I will do life with people. I will change them. This is my calling. I'm the pastor. I'm the shepherd. I'm responsible. I'm the revival. So put your expectations on the mirror on yourself.
So good.
Be the change.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. That's so good. And Phil, just before we close, kind of a final kind of thought from yourself. You know, many here lead churches. God's call will be to continue to lead that church. But what would you maybe gently push back on? Give me a gentle challenge, push back on with the whole thing of discipleship, cost that we're willing to pay. People say, well, no, I feel I'm called to lead this church in this community, but I've heard what's been said. You know, I want to, what could be a healthy pushback, a healthy challenge for us all as church leaders?
Well, I think what Mojtaba and Debrina are describing for us is radical obedience to Jesus.
Great.
And that's really easy for us to applaud because we kind of think it means something we don't cherish very much. But that's rarely what it is. Usually, radical obedience to Jesus means sacrificing things you care very passionately about.
Yeah.
And I think as I've been walking with the Iranian believers, I've basically written a book which is telling their story to the Western world that will come out later this year. And the reason it's called the Forgotten Manifesto is their conviction is that Jesus has taught us how to see revival come. In a nutshell, the message they've given me is there are 3 commissions in the Bible, 3 commissions in the Gospels. The Great Commission we talk about, Jesus says, go to all nations. But there are 2 other commissions. There's the commission to the 12 in Matthew 10, where Jesus doesn't just say go, he gives 42 verses of, this is how I want you to reach the nation. And then there's the second commission in Luke 10, where he commissions the 72. And you've got 24 verses where he doesn't just say go, he says, this is how I want you to go. And it's almost the same as Matthew 10. It's almost like he gives a set of instructions for how you see a nation turn to Christ. And then he repeats them for the 72. And then when it gets to the Great Commission, Jesus doesn't repeat them. Why would you? You've already said it twice. All you have to do is say, teach them to obey everything I commanded you. And so their assertion which I'm totally convinced about, is that the Great Commission matters so much to Jesus that he hasn't just told us to go, he's told us how to go. And the instructions are in Matthew 10 and Luke 10. Now, if that's right, it puts some detail on what Mojtaba and Debrina have just said to us. Because really, the British church is incredibly unlike what Jesus called us to do in Matthew 10 and Luke 10. And so I think if we want to take seriously the lesson from Iran, I think we need to read those 2 chapters really slowly, on our knees, before Jesus, and we need to say, this is your commission, not ours. Thank you for giving us your ideas, not ours. And how do we need to change? And that's where the rubber hits the road.
So good. That's so good. Brilliant. Why don't we close this session? Debrina, would you be up for praying for us? You doing that? Can we all stand? We're going to go for a break in a moment, but let's all stand. Stretch those legs, stretch those feet. And I just love, Debrina, if you could just pray. As I said, everyone here is in church leadership in this country in some description, and I'd love you to just pray for us, provoke us, challenge us, and just pray for us. That would be wonderful.
Jesus, you've promised, I will build my church and the gates of Hades shall not prevent against it. Lord, you are building your church, is not mine, is not ours. It is not up to me, it's up to you. So all we can do today is this. Here I am, wholly available. Take me, use me. May your will be done in my church, in my life, in my private life, in my family life, in my personal life, in my hidden life, as it is in heaven. Amen. Lord, use me. Not me through strength, through power, through my own wisdom and understanding, but by your Spirit. This is your promise. So, Lord, take me. I'm available. Use me as an instrument in your hand. And thank you that you do. Thank you that I can receive. And I can go in your power through you. Amen.